Okay, so I'm here in the Gold Coast, in Surfers Paradise Beach more specifically. I came to watch the sunrise, but it didn't work out. It's pretty cloudy, so I didn't see the sun. And now it's daytime. It's around 5:40 a.m., something like that. And then I shot a whole video, which is this video I'm shooting, and it was apparently in slow motion. So I lost the whole video, which is kind of upsetting, but I'll shoot it again, I guess. And yeah, the main story here is why password indexes are kind of stupid, and most of them are not really that useful, to be honest. Obviously, the main password index that most people know is the Henley index, and both Henley and like other variations of password indexes, pretty much they account for how many countries you can visit as a tourist visa free, which is well really nice. Like if you're an Italian, you can visit 190 countries, or if you're like from Afghanistan, you pretty much need a visa to visit pretty much every country. Uh, that is a consideration. If you like traveling, if you like tourism, if you like just moving around, uh, it is a significant portion of what makes a passport useful. But what you can't forget is that passports are actually attached to citizenships, and citizenships afford you many more privileges and obligations than simply, I don't know, being being tied, let's say, to being afforded certain amount of visa-free access. There's more things that come with citizenship. And so I wanted to talk to you about other factors that most of those indexes, some of them do, even then it's still a little limited, but most of them just don't account for. First of all, obviously each the free tourist visas, uh, obviously having 190 countries you can go to freely is better than having 50, and so that is something that is of consideration. But like I said, most of the time in the top going to be in Europe, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany, and then in Asia, the UAE, Singapore, and Japan that always pretty much top the list. And like one of them is going to afford you 190 countries, and another's going to afford you 189, and another's going to afford you 188. And does that really make a difference? Like, does that one country really make it so, like, one extra visa-free access, does it really make it so one passport is better than the other? And I would argue no. I would argue that they're pretty much, in terms of visa-free access, pretty much the same, and you have to consider other factors that come with the passport to actually decide which one of them is strongest. And so, obviously, free visa tourist access, okay, check. Country perception is actually one that matters a lot. I think, let's say, if you're Canadian or if you're American, you pretty much have the same visa-free access to most countries. Canadian might be a little bit better, but well, there's a lot of hate that comes towards Americans outside of the U.S. In most parts of the world, especially in parts like the Middle East or some parts of Asia, etc. So just off the bat, even though you have pretty much the same visa-free access, I would argue that even for travel, that Canada might have a better perception and thus be a better passport to have than the American in that point of view. Uh, or like if you compare, I don't know, Italy and Israel, again, might have a similar amount of visa-free access, but if you're Israeli, some questions might be asked. Some people might not like you. Not saying it's right, not saying it's wrong. Just saying the perception of certain countries is it matters a lot, and it might make your travel a little bit easier, and it might make people greet you with a smile in the air. Just well, all considered something that I do think is relevant. Uh, Another thing is obviously freedom of movement. Because, for example, let's say you're a Singaporean citizen, you probably have the strongest passport in the world. You can travel to any country visa free, but that's it. You can travel, you can't live. So you're pretty much stuck living in Singapore, which is like a little island with very little weather variation, very little geographical variation. Whereas like if you're, I don't know, Swiss, uh, it's also a really good country. Has nearly the same visa free access, even though it's like 3 or 4 countries less than Singapore at any given month. And on top of that, you can live not only in Switzerland but in 27 EU countries and a few other associated states, like 30 plus countries that you can live in with just one passport. And it's not just countries, but also like they encompass a population that's like nearly 500 million, where Singapore is what 5 million people or 10 million people or whatever. And so obviously that's something that you have to consider as well, uh, because where you live and where you can live influences your quality of life much more than where you can travel visa free. And you can always get a tourist visa, but it's much harder for you to get like a residency visa, for example, or permanent residency, or citizenship for that matter. Uh, and yeah, that's also something that you have to consider. Another one is labor privileges. We'll take the Swiss passport as an example again. Uh, and let's take, like, for example, an Austrian passport on the other hand. So there's an Austrian working in Switzerland, and there's a Swiss working in Austria. Uh, in theory, they have access to the same labor market, but since Switzerland is not in the EU, Switzerland actually legally requires that employers prioritize Swiss people over Austrian. And so an Austrian in Switzerland is going to be a second-class worker in the sense that uh, you're only going to be able to hire an Austrian if you don't find a Swiss. And if you do find a Swiss, you're going to prioritize the Swiss. That's one thing. Whereas, like, if the Swiss go to Austria, there's no rule in Austria that says that you have to prioritize Austrians over Swiss. And so Swiss, just out of having the Swiss passport, really, even though they have, again, the same freedom of movement, the same virtually visa-free access as, let's say, Austrians, they actually have a labor advantage, which is being considered priority number one in their own country, whereas like Austrians, Italians, any other EU citizen doesn't have that privilege. And so obviously labor privileges are off consideration. Another thing is visa naturalization. Let's say if you want to become Irish, you have to live in Ireland for 5 or less 9 years, speak English. That's honestly pretty much it. Whereas like to be Swiss, you have to wait for 10 years and then you apply, and the process takes like 3 years, and it's not even guaranteed. You have to learn the language, you have to pass a test, and you have to pretty much voted in by the community as someone worthy of getting a Swiss passport. Which, in one hand, makes the Swiss passport less valuable because it might mean that you don't want to go through that hassle to get it. But on the other hand, it might make it even more valuable because you know it's so hard to get. So, like, if you do get a Swiss passport and you pass it on to your children, it's truly like something that they get for free that nearly everyone else who isn't born Swiss really has to work for. And that also influences, I guess, how valuable a passport is considered. Uh, Other types of visas. So we've talked pretty much about freedom of movement, that is residency, and about tourist visas. But there's a lot of different visas that you can get. I'm on a working holiday right now in Australia, and if I were not a citizen of a certain amount of countries, I could not get in on a working holiday. And even within the working holiday, there's the 417, and then there's the 461, 468, something like that. And the 417 is just better. It doesn't require you to have proof of English. It doesn't require you to have gone to college. It's pretty much instantaneous. And so even among countries that can have the working holiday, there's still some countries that are preferred or have an easier access than others. Another example is Australians. When they move to America, they can apply for an E3 visa. It's just kind of a sponsorship visa, but specifically for Australians. And whereas getting a J1 visa or an H1B visa is actually really hard. Sometimes you have to go through lotteries and all that. Australians just have the easiest access in terms of labor market for participation to the U.S. in the world, along with like Canada and Mexico because they're part of NAFTA. And so that's something that isn't a tourist visa. It's not a freedom of movement scenario either, but it does make it easier for you to work in a certain other country because of bilateral agreements, because of just proximity overall between countries and treaties that they have currently signed. And so, if you're a New Zealander or an Australian, you have pretty much the same tourist visa access, the same freedom of movement because they can both live in either country. They have pretty much same passport in most sense, but then Australians can more easily move to America because of the E3 visa. And so, in that sense, if you're a Kiwi or an Australian trying to move to America, having an Australian passport might actually be a strength for you. It might actually give you a certain amount of advantages. And last but not least, there's just overall linked obligations, right? So there's a lot of linked obligations to being a citizen. Like I said, having a passport is not just having a piece of paper, it's actually being a citizen of the country. And every country is going to come with rights, with privileges, but also with obligations that you kind of have to follow. And so if you're in Singapore, if you're in Switzerland, you're a citizen, you have to, when you turn 18, there's mandatory conscription, at least for males. And that means that You're either going to have to be joining the military for a while, doing community service. In Switzerland, they also allow you to contribute a certain part of your income for a certain amount of time. There are options, but it is something that you have to take into consideration. Whereas if you're Italian or American or I don't know British, you don't really have to do that in that sense. And another obligation is some countries you have the obligation of only being a citizen of that country. Singapore is the best example of that, but Austria is also like that. Netherlands is also like that. Germany was like that until recently, and that is such a big commitment. Because let's say just the Singaporean passport is best in the world, but you could either have just a Singaporean passport, or you could have an EU passport, North American passport, and let's throw in Australian or New Zealand passport. And so, on the one hand, you have the strongest passport in the world, but you only have the strongest passport in the world. You don't have any other passport. And on the other hand, you have three slightly weaker passports that give you an infinitely bigger amount of labor movement, even travel freedom, to be honest. Different perceptions, where you can use a passport to get to certain countries and another passport to get into other countries. They give you infinitely more geographical variety. Whereas, like, if you're just a Singaporean citizen, sure, you can travel anywhere, be a tourist anywhere. You could apply for residence permits anywhere, but you're only ever guaranteed access to Singapore, which is one little small island nation state with a very specific weather, with a very specific everything, really. And that you might not, even if you enjoy it there, your children might not enjoy it, and it's going to be harder for them to move. Whereas if you're American, you can at least move to a very different state. And if you're European, that's even better. You can move to a very different country, and there's no visa requirement. There's no nothing. And on top of that, you can have another path. So as you can see, you Google best passports in the world. There's always little ranking, Finnish passport, strongest on the list, Singaporean, best in the world. But you're gonna see that most of them are just size. Like one of them is 191, and then another 10 is like 190. The 12 are like 189. Like it doesn't really make a difference. Like it's not one country tourist visa access that's really gonna change how strong a passport is. It's all the things that are just entailed here. All the obligations, all the privileges, the freedom of movement, the freedom of labor, all the little treaties and just a visa access and all that. That's everything has to be considered when you analyze what passport is actually best for you, what combination of passports is actually best for you, and what is actually best passport in the world. And so even though Italy, France, Germany, the UAE, Singapore, Japan, they in theory have the strongest passports in the world, I would much rather have an Irish passport over those. Because it's a country low debt, stable, gives you all of Europe, and also gives you the UK in terms of freedom of movement, living, and labor movement as well. I would much rather have the Swiss passport, which is pretty much a generational asset, really, to having all the slightly stronger passports. Because the Swiss perception is a little bit better. The privileges you have in Switzerland are a little stronger. You still have access to the EU, and you have access to a lot of geographical variety in Switzerland because of the mountains, because of the plains, because of everything in between. And so, sure, it might be fun to say, oh, my passport is the strongest. It allows me to go to 192 countries. Yeah, but that might not be the only thing that you have to consider when you actually do a proper analysis of passport. Much more nuanced than that. And yeah, I'll leave it at this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys liked the view of the beach, and I'll see you around.